Welcome to this panel discussion on the educational crisis. We're very pleased to welcome you here to the Hotel Millennium here in Mayfair. The educational crisis. Perhaps that's not a term we use so much in this country, crisis, but I think there are very real challenges in education at the moment. And is there anything that matters more than education? If you're a parent, what matters more to you than your children's long-term good? What matters more than the long-term good of your children? Is there anything that matters? I'm a parent myself. I can think of nothing more really that matters than my children's good. If you're running a business, the people involved and the good of those people in the business is a significant issue. And we saw that this morning in the financial crisis discussion. Business for the common good. For those of you who are here, education matters a great deal if we are to respond to the challenges in our economy. So these questions matter a great deal. And should we just leave them to other people? This is one of the issues, I think, that sparked this event itself, the London Encounter, is we can't leave these issues just to other people, to the professionals. Obviously there are professionals here, but the inspiration for the meeting, for this engagement, is that everyone has an issue, has a relevance. So, the meeting was partly formed from a group of people, from friends. And that's why I've been drawn in, from friendships with people. Friendships make a big difference, and that's certainly something we will see in education as we go through the discussion, that relationships matter in how we educate. And education isn't just for something you gain subsequently. Will be another theme I hope we draw out with the speakers. It's not just the qualifications, or to get a good job. Education matters in its own right, and it's worthwhile in its own right if you approach it with interest, with engagement, with enthusiasm. So hopefully that will be something that comes out as well. So these are things that matter to us and to you in the audience. And we have a panel here of three speakers. My name is Peter Khan. I'll just be introducing the speakers really. I'm an educationalist at the University of Liverpool, where I'm responsible for running a doctoral degree in university leadership. But for the panel, on my right, we have David Cameron. David will be used to this.
I'm sorry.
David is an educational consultant, not the Prime Minister. But he is an interesting voice, a fascinating voice in education today. He has led reviews and presented at conferences across the UK and internationally, working with teachers, parents and governors. David has extensive experience himself as a teacher and as a senior manager in schools and local authorities. Recently, he was Director of Children's Services to Stirling Council in Scotland. Still a common country. He doesn't have as many followers on Twitter as his namesake.
Although the quality is much higher.
The Prime Minister has 769,000 followers on Twitter, and David has 3,500. But that's still a significant number.
And I'm very needy, so I will give you my Twitter tag.
So, thank you, David. Linda, on my left, Linda Sanders, is the head teacher of the Laurel School, which is a new independent school in South London with a Catholic ethos. Linda has worked in education for over 25 years, and she is passionate about character education in particular, and believes in the vital role of parents as the primary educators of their children, and that children flourish where there is a strong, trusting partnership between parents and the school. I've certainly seen, it is a very rare case of a school which Linda runs as having such a strong partnership with parents and teachers and pupils. That's certainly one of the key reasons why we invited Linda to join the panel. So we look forward to hearing of Linda's experience.
Very much.
And then our final
How did she go?
And our final speaker to complete the panel is Professor Marco Bersonelli. Professor Bersonelli is a professor in astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Milano, where he researches into cosmology. He is one of the leading scientists on the Planck space mission with the European Space Agency, and he recently was involved in some seminal results in the field from that action. Professor Bersonelli is also deeply involved in outreach work and educational activities with young people, related to science and the education of young people. He directs a foundation for secondary school children in Italy. He lectures widely in Italy and abroad. So we're glad to have you with us, Professor Bersonelli, as well. Marco. So let me just let you know about the format of this panel. We have three speakers, and we're going to have two questions initially that have been pre-arranged, and each speaker will respond to each question, and I may pose an additional question after those questions. And then subsequently there will be an opportunity for questions from the floor in the final part of the discussion. So if you want to have a question, we'll bring a microphone to you. We'll be able to have a few questions as part of the panel. So that is our format for today. So if you join me, you're welcome the speakers for the panel. Perhaps I could ask our first question from Juliet for the panel.
Recently, I've needed to choose a school for my children, and I've started asking myself, is it enough to find the best academic school for them? And this led me on to the question, what is the most important thing in my life? And in the end, I've had to admit to myself that the most important thing for me is not just professional success. I find that I want something even more essential than success in order to live life fully. I want an awareness of and to follow the deepest desires in my heart. And I believe that this is also true for my children. Nevertheless, I have the impression that these desires are often ignored, in schools and universities today. Rather than starting from a particular interest the child might have, from which to open his or her heart and mind to the exciting adventure of life, everything seems to conspire to narrow down things to skills and qualifications. I see that both parents and teachers are walking along parallel paths in their efforts to educate children, but it is as if our paths don't meet. So, how can we, parents and teachers, awaken in children and pupils a true passion for learning?
Thank you, Julia. I'll ask David to respond first.
Okay, can I just prove the point that we Scots are not mealy-mouthed people and launch straight in on a controversial point? And that's the whole idea of choice in education. And I think the whole commitment that we currently have to choice in education, generally based on a competitive comparison between schools, based on the kind of narrow model of qualifications and academic success which you outlined in your question, I think is basically damaging, fundamentally damaging. I'm completely committed to the ideas that are outlined by colleagues from York University on the spirit level. And what the spirit level does is it sets out clearly the damaging impact that inequality has in any society where it exists. And those problems commonly associated with poverty, with deprivation, with disadvantage, affect all classes in those societies which are incredibly unequal. And we're one of them. We're one of the most unequal societies that currently exist in terms of the distribution of wealth. And if we finish up in a situation where those with social capital and understanding are able to pursue an education which adds to the advantages that they already enjoy, then we won't get an education system that actually addresses the needs of our young people nor the needs of our society. And I think we need to be absolutely clear in this, that there should be diversity in the education system and there is scope for that. But ultimately, we cannot deliver what young people need, nor can we deliver what society needs, on a system which is atomised and fragmented. There's a need for neutrality, there is a need for cooperation, there is a need to have an education system that works for all of our children, because some of them don't have parents. Some of them don't have parents who understand the deepest desires of their heart as you do. Some of them are looked after, some of them are in difficult, challenging and disadvantaged circumstances, and we need to make sure that the driver for educational improvement does not come simply through parental choice and the growth of what are deemed to be outstanding schools, but comes from a commitment to excellence for all young people across the board. And what that translates into, I think, in terms of learning, and you're absolutely right, we need forms of learning which begin from the child and continue to develop in a progressive way around the child, rather than the model that we often have just now, where the education of children is planned forward from the child in early years and backwards from assessment and qualifications as they move further forward through the system. We need an education system which recognises what children bring to it, what the communities in which it sits can bring to that education, and we need to respond to and build on that. Education does need to be a leading out, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But I also think we need to address this issue of polarity. Most teachers are parents. They're not walking parallel paths, they've only got one pair of shoes. And I think we need to recognise that that's the reality. We are not separate beings and separate entities. We mix in the same communities. We all have children, many of us, we have families. And I think you can go into schools and you can find teachers who have this view of education shared with you. And many of them, I think, are constrained by the system. They feel that there are perverse incentives in the way that they're made accountable. They feel that the focus on what's defined as success is far too narrow, and as a result of that, we narrow the system around. And what we've become good at, and I think the question's an excellent indication of this, what we've become good at is having a succession of ways in which we enable young people to cross the hurdle that's immediately in front of them, but never think about educating for the entire race. And I think it's not only a certain significant number of parents who would wish to change that situation. I think there are a significant number of teachers who would also wish to change that situation. And the secret moving forward with that is an empowerment. We have this in the Italian early years system, via Reggio. We have it in early years in Scotland. We have it in Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland. And perhaps instead of worrying about how Scotland was going to integrate with the rest of the United Kingdom, we might have benefited from a wider debate about how the rest of the United Kingdom was going to integrate with Scotland, so that you could have benefited from the Curriculum for Excellence, which was outward-looking, character-focused, takes a much, much broader approach, and instead of being built around academic attainment, is built around what we call core capacity. To be a successful learner, to be an effective contributor, to be a responsible citizen, and to be a confident individual. And I think a curriculum that moved towards that set of pillars, if you like, would come much closer to that which you seek in the deepest desires of your heart and wish to see reflected in the hearts and practices of others. I'm done
Yes, I agree with a lot of what you said, David. I agree also with the point you make. Everything seems to conspire to narrow things down to skills and qualifications. As the educationist Ron Richard said, and I'm paraphrasing madly here, it seems that we've come to mistake the curricula, the textbooks, the levelings, the targets, all of that as ends in themselves. And they're not ends in themselves, they are a means to an end. Or as Pope Benedict said many years ago too, he compared us to dinosaurs. And he said, I think we've taken, in the same way that dinosaurs took a wrong turn in their evolution, and they had more muscle than grey matter, Perhaps human beings too may have taken a wrong turning in one sense, that we've got a thick material skin but little heart, and that we may have lost the ability, or at least it's been diminished, the ability to recognise goodness, truth and beauty. And I would go to an underlying question here. What is our conception of human beings? Because that in the end will influence our vision of education, how we educate our children. And so we have to ask, what is the purpose of our life? What does it mean to lead a good life, a good, fulfilled life? At the moment, there are lots of open days on, and you go and you get the prospectus, and it says, we will help your child reach her potential and his potential. We will help your child become the best person they can possibly be. But what for? For what? And I think that is the question we have to ask. You know, what are we educating our children for? When I interview parents for admission to the school, I always ask them, what are your aspirations for your children? And 90% of them will say, to be happy, to be fulfilled, to feel good in their skins, to be able to meet the challenges of life with intelligence and cheerfully. But of course, to be happy, we also have to think about what that means. Is it just about living a life where there is no suffering, or living a life where we don't have any failures, or living a life of material wealth? Well, I would say, and this is what our school is about as well, it's about knowing the good, loving the good, and doing the good. And that is educating the heart, the mind, to do the good. And that is virtue education. So our responsibility is to show our children how to choose, to act well and choose in freedom. And when I talk about freedom, I'm not saying it's a freedom to do always what we want to do. It's the idea of having the right to choose what we should do. However, we live in a society, and this is true too, where a challenging society that espouses, if you like, relativism, where there is nothing which is objectively good or objectively true. So what paradigm of moral guidance can we give to our children? They become, if you like, this idea of, they become situation dependent. That is, they will act in one way depending on where they are, according to who they're with, according to the circumstances. And that, sometimes you think, how is it, that beautifully educated young man or woman goes off to university and then perhaps, starts binge drinking or whatever, or gets into situations that are not perhaps coherent with what he says or she says, and we all do this. But it's this idea that we are living a kind of fragmented life and not a coherent whole. And I think it's, part of being happy and fulfilled and is being a person of integrity. And I think as parents and as teachers, this is something that we can help our children to learn to do. And I think, as Alexander McIntyre said, it's helping them to find their narrative. It's a narrative quest, narrative that they're in a story, an adventure. They are the protagonists, and a quest for something good. And the way they will do that is through the cultivation of virtue. So when you ask, what can we do as parents, what can we do as teachers? Well, we have to work together to show, Ken Robinson talks about, discovering people's passion. It's discovering people's mission, vocation, not in the sense of becoming a priest or a nun, but very, very respectable, but it's in that sense of what am I here for, and what is my passion? And I think we can help our children to discover their passion for learning when we show them our passion for life, and that our lives have purpose as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a challenge for me and a very interesting opportunity to know you all. As you understood, my job is not really primarily on education and school. My work is on science research and cosmology. We study the evolution of the universe. We have a space telescope that we sent in space about 5 years ago, and we are detecting the first light of the universe as the expansion started some 14 billion years ago. And that is my work, and that is really what I always have been hoping for, even as I started as a very young kid. My dream was to basically do the things that I do now, so I feel very, very happily lucky about that. So when the question was asked, how can we awaken in our students and our children a true passion for learning, that reminded me of what I was thinking when I was a very young student or a young child. And it seems to me that the question could be also asked in these terms: what makes a young student or a young child develop a sense of reality, or what is real? Because to me, if I try to remember how I was feeling as a young child, 12, 13 years old, when I started to fall in love with the stars, with the sky, I was dreaming, and it was a big thing for me. What was the difference in that respect between me and my friends with whom I was playing? And if I would have to express it now, certainly not at that time, but now, I would say that I perceived the sky as something real. And they didn't. My friends who were not interested, they felt the same kind of connection with other things. I think this, as I was thinking about this, I think this is interesting because this is a point in which education is crucial, is to transmit, to support the development of a sense of what is real. First of all, what is real? Because what is real is not decided by us. We find the universe as it is. We didn't make the universe. We didn't do the things that are outside the place where we live. So, I think this is a big challenge today. Because if we realize that, then I think we will awake a passion for learning. We will awake the capability of asking questions, for example, about what is real. And it's interesting because recently Pope Francis, in a message that he sent to a cultural festival that I was participating in Italy, the Rimini meeting, he invited everyone to never lose contact with reality. This is the Pope's words. Or rather, this is the new thing I wanted to say. So, never lose contact with reality. Rather, to become lovers of reality, to love what is real. And as a scientist, I think I am forced, we are forced in our work, in our research work, to take reality very seriously, because we cannot invent things. We have to obey to what we see. It is our job. Even the faintest signal that we detect from the very far away sources, it is a tiny little signal, but it is real, and you have to try to ask the question, what does it mean? What does it mean? And that is the educational power, I think, of science. And that's why I think it should be taught in every school at some level. because it is unforgiving about following what is here. We cannot trespass this method, let's say. On the other hand, the real question is what is the meaning? You know, to do research, to learn, it means to develop a familiarity with the meaning of the things that we see. And I think that without perceiving the meaning, reality, any kind of reality, not only the stars or the galaxies in the universe, but any aspect of reality, without perceiving a possible meaning, at least, a hope for a meaning, then reality is not interesting, is lost. It doesn't touch us deeply enough to become interesting. And it's interesting that great scientists have always, one way or the other, expressed their passion, their desire for an ultimate meaning, not in a specifically religious, faith, but as an aptitude towards reality. For example, Einstein, just to quote one of the most important in our history. The most beautiful and deepest experience a man can have is the sense of the mysterious. The meaning that is beyond the appearance of things. And he continues, it is the underlying principle of religion as well as of all serious endeavor in art and science. This is how we are motivated to learn. As scientists, as adult researchers, but I think it's exactly the same, and even more so for our children. So I think that our schools, our attempt to help our children should be really devoted to transmit in them a sense of reality as something given, as something that they have to observe before they speak about it. They have to look at what is outside.
Before I ask the next speaker to pose a question, I would just come back to the title of the educational crisis. You can look at the educational crisis in different ways, and perhaps you might see it constituted in scarred relationships or in a lack of meaning in life. But I'd be interested to know, perhaps from a couple of the speakers, how the passion for learning, how the curricula with capacities that David described, how the sense of meaning might constitute a response and might actually constitute an answer or a response to some kind of these challenges we face in our society.
Quote from Robert Fry, which I think is wonderful, which is if some of our teachers would remember the foibles and mannerisms of others, their kindness and encouragement, or their fierce devotion to standards of work that we probably didn't share at the time. And if those inspired us most, we remember what they cared about, and that they cared about us and the person that we might become. It is the quality of caring about ideas and values, this fascination with the potential for growth within people, this depth and fervour about doing things well and striving for excellence, that comes closest to what I mean in describing a passionate teacher. And in a sense, that quote for me sums up a huge amount about what's best in current practice. If you were to, contrary in a sense to some of the points about crisis in education, if you were to go to influential researchers, just now, like John Hattie in particular from New Zealand, Hattie said that if there was one thing he could achieve, it would not be change in the system. It would be leveling up consistently towards that which is best currently in the system. There are teachers, like the passionate teacher that Robert Pride described, in the system now. My life was changed by my teacher, by one teacher in particular, who introduced me to the library, introduced me to the world of books. And I grew up in a home where we didn't read books. I was a decent reader technically, but I read comics. But what he did was he sent at the library away. I took out a book by D.H. Lawrence, and some of you, if you've broadly worked out my age and you've a good sense of British social history, will have worked out which D.H. Lawrence book it was. It was a very early example of the self-directed read. It opened at the passages that I thought you would find particularly interesting, so it saved you a whole lot of time in searching. And that opened up a whole range of different new worlds to me. I then read fearlessly and voraciously, and it took me from being an army boy, growing up in an isolated community in the west coast of Scotland, where the gene pool was so shallow that we all shared one eyebrow. And it made me a citizen of the world. And that's not, some imaginary future teacher. That's a teacher that existed when I was at school, some time ago. And that's echoed, wonderful quote, Black American women giving evidence to the Commission in Teaching America's Future. I was supposed to be a welfare statistic. It is because of a teacher that I sit at this table. I remember her telling us one cold, miserable day that she could not make our clothing better, she could not provide us with food, she could not change the terrible segregated circumstances under which we live. She could introduce us to the world of reading, the world of books, and that's what she did. And what a world. I visited Asia and Africa, I saw magnificent sunsets, I tasted exotic foods, I fell in love and danced in wonderful halls. I ran away with escaped slaves and stood beside a teenage martyr. I visited lakes and streams and composed lines of verse. I knew then what I wanted to do. I wanted to help children do the same things. I wanted to weave magic. She became a teacher. It's the title of John Jones' book. That whole concept of passion around that simple idea of caring what you're teaching, to get what you had when you spoke. Fantastic listening to you because of the clarity and passion about the subject matter with which you're engaged. And when we get that in education, combined with a similar degree of passion and engagement with the young people in front of us and who they might become, then I think we begin to get the kind of change that we're looking for. But what we have to do is empower them through staff development, empower them through engagement and better partnership, and stop encumbering them around the kind of mindless accountability which we see far too often in the current system.
You said it eloquently. I mean, I think all of us here, we feel ourselves reflected in what you say when you think about that teacher, those teachers who have that impact in your life at school, for good or for bad. I always remember reading at one point in his life, Wittgenstein was, he spent a few years teaching in some village in Germany, and he was a terrible teacher. He treated his pupils incredibly badly. And years later, he decided to go back and find those old pupils who've now grown up, they were now adults. And he didn't find all of them, obviously he found some of them. He went and knocked on their doors to apologise. And some of them wouldn't accept his apology. True, because they've been so deeply scarred by... So, a teacher can work so much good and also can certainly harm us too. I mean, I remember... It's interesting. I don't think ever teachers... we can never underestimate their impact on children. I have a twin sister, and we went to school up in Manchester, and we came from a very working class primary school to quite a sort of, it was a posher, if you like, secondary school, and we had never done French before, so we were the worst pupils in the class at French, and the girls who were the worst pupils in French ended up doing Spanish, and those who were better did Latin. And so we were sent into the Spanish class, and we were told, you're doing French because you're not good at languages. Well, that for me... I mean, you're doing Spanish because you're not good at languages. So, but that teacher who said that to me, she actually said that to both of us. I ended up you know, doing a degree in Spanish and Portuguese and all the rest of it at university, it actually had the opposite effect. So you never know, you know, how these things can affect you as a child. But what we have to be aware of is the enormous responsibility we have.
Yeah, just one. Thank you to both of you for what you said now. Just to add one thing is a teacher. For me too. As time goes on, I remember more and more clearly. I realize more and more clearly the impact of some teachers in my life, and so I can try to ask what do they have in common? I mean, these people, and you know, passion indeed. But then I could add this, that I think that passion is not just a technique or a psychological training that allows you to present things in a certain way. Because students realize immediately if what you are, if it is a passion or if it is a technique. Maybe not immediately, but maybe yes, maybe immediately. And the younger they are, and the more immediately they realize. And one thing that I would say is that to live a passion, to experience passion, you have to be in a sort of dramatic situation. You are not passionate about something if you are not striving to understand it more. If you don't have something open with that thing that you are talking about, if it is not living for you. And this is why universities are set up the way they are, and they should work in that way. That what I teach is in a university is also something that I'm researching on. But I think similarly, and more deeply I would say, should happen when you are in elementary school, or because the teacher is learning together with the pupil. The teacher has an open approach to the next day that is starting now. You don't know what will happen, and I think this being open, because the meaning, we're talking about meaning, without which there is no education, basically, right? It's just instructions, this is not education. But meaning is not just a statement that you write down and that's it. It's a living experience. It's something, the teacher is a witness of that meaning, and is witnessing that it's worthwhile to learn these things because you get more into reality. So that is my addition to what you just said.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question that we have prepared already. So Chiara, if you'd like to read your one. Thank you.
My children are growing up and they're starting to ask questions about life. And I realized that if I've never considered the questions before for myself, I'm at a loss for words. And it is actually an effort to answer meaningfully to them. However, if I instead have posed to myself the same questions, sometimes previously, then the answer comes to me almost naturally. And I discovered that it is not a matter of answering a question anymore, but it is, I'm telling them my experience, in words they can understand, obviously. This has made me realize two things. One, as you were saying before, is that to educate is to help a human being to engage with reality in its totality, without neglecting anything of it, any single aspect. And the other thing is that I myself need to be constantly educated if I am to educate my own children. And I'm also convinced of the primary responsibility of parents in educating their children from the earliest years. But when the young people grow and they start taking their own steps in the world, and then they begin to judge what's around them for themselves, then I see that it is important for them to find other adults compared to parents
to whom they can relate, because then they start not wanting to talk to parents anymore. So they need to find adults to whom they can relate in the same way as they have been able to do with their parents before. So my questions are to, what is your experience of being educated as an adult, and what is your perspective on the fact that children, young adults, need to find other adults to relate to instead of, or together with their parents?
Well, I can speak of the experience. I totally agree that as children, especially as they enter into adolescence, it's incredibly empowering and powerful to have other adults that they admire. They see things in them that they admire, that they can relate to them and they can talk to them. And I have to talk about the school where I am now, but it's from an experience from the school where I was heading in Spain as well. We established this tutorial system, so each child has a personal tutor, somebody who is there to guide, to encourage, to listen to that child as they grow and they begin to develop and have all sorts of experiences. Because I think sometimes, it's not just about learning geography or learning physics. It's the whole child. You take yourself always, heart, body, soul, everything into that classroom, and it's important that they can have somebody that they can relate to, apart from their parents, who they can talk to about. I've had an argument with my friend at playtime, and that's affecting my learning. That's not just a trivial, and certainly not a trivial incident for that child at that moment. And so to be able to have somebody who is there, who is actually totally interested in an adult, a really important adult in their lives, who's interested in them as a person, that's an amazing learning experience for that child. And as they go through the school, this has been my experience as a tutor as well, it's a very humbling experience, because children will open up to you, they will tell you all sorts of things about themselves, their aspirations, their fears, their sorrows, their joys, and you share that with them as they go through the school. And it goes beyond the school. I'm still in touch with a lot of my old tutees, and I think that is something wonderful that you can give to the children as an opportunity to grow and to develop and to reflect. And it's also about challenging them. We're not sitting there we're also trying to help them grow and develop as human beings in that journey that they have, that educational journey that doesn't stop when they leave the school. And also, I think you said about parents. Yes, parents are the prime educators of their children. Where children learn how to be social virtue, how they learn to be who they are, is in their family, with their parents. And I know that, as you said, not everybody has that great luxury, if you like, or privilege, and it should be a right, but it isn't always, to grow in a caring, loving family. But that is actually where they will flourish best. And when that works, parents with the school, and there's a close connection, and you're working together as one, then that obviously is for the good of the child. So yes, I totally think that if we could try and do that more. A good teacher tries to do that. A teacher, because you're not just going into that classroom and teaching physics, you're also going in there and you're caring about every single child in that classroom. And you are there for them, but it is very difficult when you've got 30, obviously, to be able to do that.
So, what does it mean for me now to be educated? I think it's a very good question, because I totally agree that, I kind of was trying to say something similar earlier. I totally agree that to educate, you need to be in movement yourself. I see that very clearly in my research group. I mean, now I'm talking about, you know, my younger collaborators, and I do feel, let's say, an educational responsibility in a different level than, you know, for the secondary school students of the school I participate. But even there, I can see very clearly that you know, the credibility that you have at every level, you know, from younger collaborators to your younger kid, you know, your son. The credibility is not so much in us being perfect, but is in the truth by which we love what we love and we believe what we believe. We always will be making mistakes in research and as parents. And I think a lot of schizophrenia today is that people think that the problem is not to make any mistake. So there is you know, everybody is fighting by taking responsibility because there is no way. And so there are all this legalistic schema, no? Where you try to defend yourself even before you do anything, right? And I think that is very dangerous. It's dangerous because it does not correspond to nature. Nature is risky. Life is risky. To deliver a baby, you risk your life as a woman. That is nature, right? And we are trying to substitute our schemes to nature. So, in that sense, it's clear that being an educator means to take a responsibility. And it means to live on myself. Let's say the proposal that I offer to the younger, be them, you know, collaborators, be them your children. And the second thing I would say, what does it mean for me in practice, or let's say in the real life? I like a sentence that Pope Francis said in Rome in an occasion which was about school, when there was this gathering, I think it was the 10th of May last year. He quoted an African proverb which goes like, to make a man requires a village, something like that. To make, what is it?
It takes the whole village to start.
Okay, it takes the whole village to make a child, but I would say to make a man. I would extrapolate to myself now, because what I wanted to say is I live in a village. I think it's essential to live in a village, to be an educator, even to be a father or a mother. I don't think there is a way you can be father or mother if there is not a larger context in which you regain in time, you deepen your awareness of what it means to be father and mother. So being in a village, I think, is essential. And my experience in particular with the school in which in the past couple of years I've been involved in Milan, which is a set of schools from, you know, the youngest to from 3 years to 18 years. It is, for me, a big education opportunity. Because it is the context of the friendship with the others with whom I follow this, and I try to understand more in depth the originality of the charisma that gave birth to the school, which comes from Father Giussani, the important educator in Italy. And it's not that I know, you know, the development that will happen, but I know that I am not alone in this path. So I think this is, you know, the context in which we should try to maintain ourselves as adults is the village that the Pope was talking about.
question because it made me think. And as an adult, I think I've come more and more to understand learning is about the way I engage with the world. So I learn constantly. I read Murakami's book, The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles, finished it a week ago. And I learned so much from that about Murakami's way of seeing the world, about some of the issues that he raised within a book which is almost magically realism. It's not a text on education. But I learned as much. I went out a week past Friday to a residential school for young people who are either highly challenging or highly vulnerable. Young people who effectively have been pushed out the education system because they can't be controlled in mainstream or because they are so much at risk. You know, a girl who self-harms actually eats herself. And I learned a huge amount from that experience and took a lot away from that experience with me, which I try and process and translate into a clearer way of thinking about the world as I experience it. And I think that's the fundamental element of being an adult learner, is having that commitment to engagement and that commitment to exploring experience, whether it comes through literature, whether it comes through life, wherever it comes from. And I think it relates back to the first question, because we didn't probably tackle sufficiently the element in the first question about how we create that passion for learning. And I think one of the ways that you do that is you convey that sense and capacity of being able to gain from experience in a different way because you have that commitment to learning. You know, the standard quote that people will come out with now is that in a world of constant change, the learner will inherit the earth, while the learner will remain beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. And infusing that sense in young people with curiosity, and I think as a learning model, then you need to explore that you know, the Gove model. Anybody remember Michael Gove? And well, there's some teachers still in therapy, haunted by it. You know, they say, oh God, he's coming back. But let's not demonize. But the Gove model was all about transmission. You know, this whole model of education is around transmission and supported by a whole number of new educational writers. Robert Peel, Daisy Christodoulou, a number of other writers like that, who are all about the transmission of knowledge based on the work of a psychologist called Hirsch. Anyway, I threw that in because I was feeling my educational credibility was actually suffering a bit by comparison with this here. So anyway, just to let you know, I read a few books, but I think it is about getting that engagement. And one of the comments I make is that learning is as much about the transfer of energy as it is about the transmission of knowledge. And that's one of the key things I think we need to get to in terms of adult learning. The second part, or rather the first part of your question, as you pose that, is a counsel of despair. Because what on earth has happened that engagement of young people and adults doesn't happen? I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? That, I mean, it's German sociologists who divided society in periods into Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft being the society of community, and Gesellschaft, I think, being the society of alienation. And we continue to inflict that alienation on ourselves. We operate in a situation here in London where people live in one area and send their children to school in another, where we actively destroy the engagement with community by the choices that we make. We've come to accept a world where competition is not only a desirable element in business or industry, but suddenly in education also. Now, I'm not against a healthy element of competition in sport, in education, or elsewhere, but we've accepted it as a byword for progress. The whole culture of opening up schools to the market that we talk about, and the idea of privatising education, is all part of this breakdown towards the individual. And as we break down towards the individual, we not only create a situation where adults are alienated, we create a situation where children are alienated. And of course what we then have to do is we then have to put in place the kind of tutorials that you were talking about. We have to put in place mentoring. We have to put in place all of these things because we've destroyed them as natural elements within community. And what we need to make sure about is that when we think about how we educate, we think not simply about the impact that it has on individual children. We think about it in terms of the impact that it has much more widely. Education is challenged with social mobility. That's what we constantly talk about in education, is its power to generate social mobility. Social mobility is about removing people from the community and class by and large, and without any necessary responsibility to help others to achieve the same progress. Education should also be about social change. And we need to think about how we increase that capacity in education to change, so that we build communities and not repair them. And I think that's the challenge in response to that part of the question. So, me around.
So there's very strong parallels coming out in all the comments there in the panel around the educational village, relationships, notion of a community. And to see people do it is what you need. It doesn't happen automatically or by government fiat. I mean, you can work towards it, but it's placed on each of us and each of you to make it possible and to realise it. It's not someone else's job. Would any other speakers like to comment further before we open up the floor?
I'd like to open up the floor. You look like a floor. I want to open up.
Great, we have a microphone to come round. So if you would like to pose a question to the panel, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you and I'll call on someone particularly to do that. So the hand already over here on here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm not a teacher and I'm not a parent yet, but I work as a doctor, and I always have to deal with people with fragilities, which can be physical or psychological or sentimental. I always find it difficult to look at them, because I prefer sometimes to hide the fragility, because it takes more time, energies, and also because I feel much more impotent. But I understand that, for example, Virginia Woolf, she had the writers, she had a great, she was one of the best writers, but at the same time she had a big fragility to carry. And so my question is, how do you stand in front of people and in front of children who has a fragility, and what do you, and how can you face them?
My tendency is to assume the fragility. And if I may quote William McIlvanney, Scottish poet, "And so adrift in unknown selves we lie, abandoned to dark cups of circumstance, not knowing what will come or what we'll do, or where the tides of sleep will wash us, and shy from the sculling shapes that feed in mind, feel every certainty drift out of reach, and sigh and hold each other, Christ with touch, to share what is not shareable, and know the jerking terror of time's undertow, and madly try to dream ourselves a beach." And I think there's a real richness and relevance in that piece from McIlvanney. And I think for most of us, there is that fragility somewhere. I think we generally, we have to strive. We have to, I think we are all, one way or another, we are prisoners of our background. We are prisoners of who we are. I think if you look, and it's interesting that you come from a medical perspective, if you look at the work of Harry Burns, who is the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, and you look at what Harry Burns talks about in terms of the determinant of low life expectancy in certain parts of Scotland. I mean, there are parts of Scotland now where life expectancy is lower than it is in the Gaza Strip. Right? And, you know, the original theory was because we drank too much. Actually, the Finns drink more than us. So rather than drink like a fish, you drink like a fin. We thought it was possibly the Iron Brew. Maybe caused some strange form of metal poisoning. We thought it was perhaps smoking, and then we banned smoking. Ultimately, the cause that Harry Burns identifies is the build-up of cortisol as a response to stress, coming from the numbers of young people who grow up in uncertainty, where they don't know what response a cry, a shout will bring, where they have no certainty not only of whether there will be a response or not, but what the nature of that response will be. And I think one needs to assume that that fragility is there, and finding, as far as one can, what the nature of the fragility is, depends on that willingness of engagement. And what we need, I think, is we need to fully recognise the professionalism of teachers and educators with regard to that. You know, there are people now, one of Gove's advisors, Guy Dominic Cummings, talks about unqualified teachers and how it would be fine to have unqualified teachers. There is no such thing. If you're not qualified, you're not a teacher. If you're unqualified, you might be able to make a contribution to children's education. It does not make you a teacher in that professional sense, because the professional skill of the teacher is that ability to find and understand the needs, abilities and attributes of the learner, and to bring those together with that which must be learned. And that's a higher level of professional skill, which demands that one builds that capacity to access and better understand the fragility of those who confront us, and not be blinded by the talent which might overlay it, nor indeed the circumstances and inadequacies which might overlay it, but to constantly seek, and when we discover it, to try together, to madly try to dream ourselves a beach.
I would like to say that being on the hit face, as it were, of seeing girls, we have a pupil this year who came from a school where she'd been bullied because, I'm not saying just because, but because, you know, she has dyspraxia, she has a certain area of fragilities, if you like, that mean that she could be an easy target. I would say that we have to love them, and in one way I would say that more important than being, we have to have qualified teachers, but more importantly we have to have people, we have to have teachers who want to be better people and want to know and want to, and I think when children see that teachers themselves are striving to be better people, as you say, no one is perfect, and that we ourselves, you know, we make mistakes, and that we are trying to do our job as well as we can, and to love those children as well as we can. I think, as I don't know which one of you said, that you can't fake. You have to be authentic. You have to try to be a person of integrity. And I strongly believe that when you have a teacher, looking back again at the teachers that I've had in my life, the teachers that, it's not been the one who's had the greatest technical skill, it's the one who I felt has loved me the most and who has cared for me the most. That for me has made the difference.
Just one bit bit is that, as David was saying, indeed we all can recognize fragility in ourselves. I think this is important because that, I think, is the key to where to look for something that stands in front of somebody else's fragility. I mean, is there something in our experience, in our human experience that resists, that is stronger in a sense than our failures and our weaknesses and our fragility? If there is something there, that is most likely what to look at, to offer also to others, and to maintain in our sight, to maintain in our consciousness when we deal with somebody else's fragility. The thing is that this is not a statement. I mean, what makes us non-desperate in front of our failures and our fragility, our disaster sometimes, right? If there is something that gives us hope continuously, that starts over, that is something very important, no? Because it is something that is a hope for anybody. And even if we don't have the answer, and we most likely don't have answers, in front of big issues, big difficulties. But the problem is not to solve the problem. I think it's very important. The problem is not to wait for a time where there will be no fragility in front of, we will be not confronted by fragility. But is there something now that is more solid than the fragility that we have in front of us? And I think this is our hope, the foundation for our hope.
And it also remains talent.
Further questions?
Do you think that independent and private schools can or should play a role in balancing out the inequality present in the current education system? And if so, what do you think they can do?
I think it's difficult. I listened to the head of Eton on that educators programme that I referred to earlier, talking about the role and potential contribution of private schools. And I think an awful lot of the discourse around that is based around that concept that I spoke about, around social mobility, around giving individual young people the opportunity to advance beyond their circumstances. And the Marxist standpoint would be that you rise with your class and not beyond it. That real progress and real social mobility comes when you take people with you. And that's where I think there's a risk with a fragmented system of private and public education. I think we've reached a worrying situation in this country where in some parts of the United Kingdom, public education is more expensive than private education because it's the quality of the school that drives the house prices. And the impact that makes in terms of the mortgages that people are prepared to pay to get into the catchment areas of particular schools becomes frightening. And I think that whether or not one accepts the viability of private schools or alternative provision, I think what we need to do within that is address this need to have a commitment across the system to reducing inequality. Not by a levelling down necessarily, but by a levelling up. I mean, I spoke in my opening answer about the spirit level, and quite clear evidence in that book that alongside massive levels of inequality, we see massive issues around mental health, around physical well-being, around all of these things. We need to be aware that education is a societal factor which has a tremendous influence on how we all live our lives and has a huge potential for that. And if we can get that commitment to neutrality, to understanding, to the fullest possible development of all our children, regardless of their circumstances or background, then within that I'm prepared to work with others to see how a mix of provision might best meet that goal. But if we don't start from that position, and we don't start from that commitment, my fear would be that private education, particularly as currently constituted in this country, is much more likely to be divisive than to be unifying or constructive. And I think quite clearly one of the things that we've seen recently is that a cabinet largely recruited from the Bullington Club doesn't actually guarantee much key awareness of what's happening across the rest of society and how we can have conversations about economic success while we have food banks across the United Kingdom and a level of charitable provision which would actually reflect that of the 1930s and the Great Depression is actually frightening, and it speaks to a level of disengagement of our political classes from the realities of their communities. And I'm not certain that that's helped by that divisive element within education. So, in brief, if we can have an ideological commitment to education as a unifying rather than divisive factor, a recognition that one of the driving forces for us is to enhance excellence rather than acquire outstandingness. If we get that ambition and aspiration for all, then I'm prepared to have a discussion about how we might best complement the provision that we have within the system so that we get the best for all of our children.
I completely agree, and the only thing I would say is this, that just as little experience on our own Italian situation, which is different from here. One thing I realized in this couple of years, being directly engaged in a school, which is a non-state school, it's a private, is that by nature of this school, we have a richness, a vision of what is education, with all the limits that we have. But we realize that we have such a richness that is not given to the state school in the surroundings. And for many years we have been quite rightly trying to defend our, right to survive and to be recognized as a public service to the community, as it was just said. But I think it is also important that we realize how rich we are, not in terms of money, unfortunately, because that's really the struggle. But how rich we are in terms of vision and of potential good for everybody, not just for the kids that come to our school, you see. And so, in practice, we are trying to do, and we have already started to do some common initiative with state schools in the surroundings, because they're not enemies. I personally feel ultimately the same struggle, the same responsibility somehow for those kids as well as for those that come to our school. So I don't know what that means, but I think that there is an awareness that we have to grow on the richness of what has been given to us because of what we received. Being in this village, or villages or communities like this, being in touch with great educators that gave us a road to follow, which other people don't have. They are much more poor than we are. You see, so I think it's an interesting challenge to look at things in this way.
You echo my sentiments, exactly. because the school that we have here in South London is very much similar, I would say, to the school that you are running in Italy. And it's the same, yes, I mean, we want this to have an effect for everybody, what our educational vision is, what we bring, which is something I think I would say is unique here in the United Kingdom at the moment. This idea of the much deeper implication of the parents in the school, not in the sense of, you know, of course, organising the summer fete, that yes, but it's more than that. It's being involved directly in their children's education. And I think this is something that if we can, you know, you can spread that to other, I think that we are already doing some sort of good. But it is a dilemma. It is when the foundation set up this school, they did look at other ways of doing it. They didn't want to set up an independent school necessarily, but in the end it was the way that they were able to realise their educational vision, shall we say, was having to go through the independent route. And you know, you want to give that opportunity to everybody. You want to share that educational vision with everybody.
One last question before we do finish. On the corridor here, towards the middle.
We could try and answer really quickly and then we squeeze some more in.
So, thank you very much for the fantastic talk. My question arises from the fact that in 10 days I have to deliver my first lecture at the university. And I work in a working environment where university is thought to be an exchange of information between students and staff and vice versa. And on the other hand, this is clearly not enough because my students are not engaged in the reality, or if something falls of the plan, of the general plan, they cannot challenge it, they are very fragile. So this way of interpreting university is not enough, there is something more. But my question is, how can I introduce them to this, that there is something more, something better than just an exchange of notions and information, that there is also an higher education, let's say that.
A very quick answer. I think if we allow them to frame the questions, and you spoke about this beforehand today, I think one of the interesting things about the university model is the divide between the lecture, which I think increasingly is an ineffective way of communicating information, and the tutorial. And I think it's within that tutorial context, hopefully, that we can hope to energise and innovate students around learning. And I think particularly now through the MOOCs, you know, massive online opportunities, I think the opportunities for engagement online are huge. I think if we can bring these opportunities together, then to some extent you can begin to free yourself from the strain efforts. One of the things I'm impressed by is the number of educators now across the board, but particularly in universities, who are putting their lectures online, so that the expectation is that the students will have come in having had the lecture. It's a bit like the Scottish thing about you'll have had your tea. So you come in and you'll have had your lecture, and the opportunity then becomes one of engagement around the lecture rather than its delivery. Okay.
Yeah, I would also say making them the protagonists of the learning, awakening the passion that they must have. I mean, my twin sister, who I mentioned earlier, she's a university lecturer, and she said that over the years she's noticed how students, rather than coming to the university for the love of the learning, they're coming and they're very obsessed about whether they're getting a first or a 2-1 or whatever. That's become the focus of their concerns, and it's reawakening that that must have taken them there in the first place. That curiosity, that passion that they will have through making them, I would say, the protagonists of their own learning by involving them in, as you say, in this way of them, in a sense, driving it as much as they could.
So I will just not repeat things that I completely agree with you two just said. My experience in teaching at university is that I'm never satisfied with my teaching, and I enjoy it a lot at the same time. I love it, I mean. But I'm always looking for a better way, a better example. And what I realize, and year after year, I change a little bit things to improve it, and then, and my wife always tells me, but come on, this is the 5th year that you teach the same course, and you still work hours on it. And you know, I have a very heavy research life, let me say, so, but I can't do without it. And why? If I ask myself, is that I think living in this village, I care a lot about those students. And that is what gives me the need, to some extent, the desire and the need to be clear, to do my job well. Not because I have to do it well, because for a moralistic kind of thing. It's a need, you know. I'm not, and so this is what I would suggest. Try to do it well, but for this reason.
And establishing relationships. I mean, that also is a key, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You know, when you
very much. We need to finish there. Just before we thank our speakers one final time, just a couple of brief announcements. There are exhibitions following you're welcome to view. There'll be a guided tour of the exhibition on John Henry Newman, I'll be getting shortly. There's also food still available from the bar, so you can stay on. There's the evening concert later in the evening, so plenty of things going on, so do join in for further activities. As you leave the hotel, there'll also be an opportunity to pass on your contact details if you want to stay in touch, if you've enjoyed today's events and be interested in joining a future event. So perhaps we can just thank our speakers for their time.